we will now move on to our first keynote presentation. The Reverend Duncan Dormer was the president and is currently the Dean of St. John's College in the University of Cambridge. He served there as the elected head of fellowship, as a tutor, and as the Director of Studies for Theology and Religious Studies. He also teaches sociology and anthropology of religion in the University of Cambridge and serves on a number of national church bodies, including the Anglican Roman Catholic Committee.
He has published works on the relationship between religion, sexuality, and gender, as well as on the theology on Pope Francis. His topic today is titled, Jewel in the Crown, the Oxbridge College, its origin, character, and future. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Dormer on stage.
Well, thank you very much for that extremely warm introduction. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here in HKU again, and I'm really looking forward to learning an immense amount over the next couple of days. Thank you also to the Vice-Chancellor for your opening remarks. You covered some territory very succinctly, which I hope everybody heard, which was around the confounding factors in terms of Oxbridge education, which I'd really like you to register, and we may come back to. Personally, I really enjoy the Q&A in these sessions, so I'll try not to overrun, and I know that there's somebody with a little bit of paper saying, there we are, 5 minutes, 1 minute, cut, so I'll try and behave. Okay, so my paper is concerned with a very particular and unique, one could say peculiar, model of collegiate education, the Oxbridge College, and the claims which are made for it. I'm talking as someone who is deeply invested in the system, having studied at one such college in Oxford, Magdalen, and worked at another St. John's College in Cambridge, the latter in a number of different roles, which have ranged over a portfolio of pastoral, teaching, and management responsibilities. So, in the next 40 minutes or so, what I'm going to try and do is explain what I'm trying to get at with my metaphor of a jewel in the crown, provide some key background information on the two universities in terms of what we mean when we talk about them as collegiate universities. I'm going to give you a quick, and it will be very quick, we've got a lot of territory to cover in 800 years, a quick historical sketch. How did we get here? I then want to look at how Oxbridge colleges work as social organisations, and especially how they've changed and reinvented themselves, before exploring a little bit how learning may be enhanced by this shape of a learning environment. And then I'll come to some final points. So, jewel in the crown. I've chosen the metaphor, jewel in the crown, to convey that sense of an outstanding centrepiece within something of great value, as a way of opening up some of the questions and some of the issues involved in thinking about the Oxbridge model. So the crown here is collegiality. Collegiality is that quality that arises when colleagues work together, united in a common purpose with mutual respect for one another's abilities, in a fairly egalitarian environment in which independence of thought is highly valued. Collegiality, it seems to me, is utterly essential to the business of universities. It's essential both to the education of students, but also, of course, to the intellectual life of scholarship and research. It's essential, but it's also pretty costly in various ways, as its nurture requires the creation of certain sorts of space, of autonomy, and the fostering and maintenance of particular kinds of relationship, in addition, of course, to quite significant financial commitments. Collegiality requires certain forms of social organisation and sociality. It involves also what we might call the reproduction of moral persons. For whether we are conscious of it or not, whether we attend to it or not, our institutions and communities replicate certain virtues and values. And we therefore have the capacity to cultivate not just understanding, we don't just create knowledge, we also ultimately shape wisdom and personal integrity. Such high ideals are under constant threat from political and economic forces, that is, from the state and from the power of markets, and most immediately from instrumental, reductive, and bureaucratic forms of thinking and practice. Collegiality comes in many shapes and cultural forms. The question here is whether Oxbridge colleges provide a particularly useful example to think with, and whether or how such emulation is possible or indeed desirable. So, let me then come to elitism. Jewels and crowns, of course, speak pretty ambivalently in that they talk about status and prestige, power and wealth. So one of the key questions that has to be asked of Oxbridge relates to the question of elitism. Obviously, these are elite institutions, and there's no denying their place in the intellectual firmament. They are also very clearly places that lie at the heart of the production of the British elite, in a range of areas that go well beyond scholarship and science, not least politics, for example. It is startling that even in the post-World War II era, 10 of the 14 prime ministers went to one university, Oxford, and of the other 4, 3 didn't go to university at all. Elitist, of course, but the crux is, what sort of elites? What sorts of people enter into this world? Does Oxbridge perpetuate rather narrow and closed traditional elites, accessed by birth or patronage, rooted in family connections, inherited wealth and religious status? A sort of superior intellectual finishing school for young gentlemen and ladies? Or open, broad, new elites based on educational qualification, the determination to succeed, distinctive cultural skills, and accessed by competitive means? The third opening point I wish to make relates to mythology. I am deeply conscious that the Oxbridge system is opaque to the outsider, and frankly, pretty mysterious most of the time for the insider. It's a highly and continually mythologized place of mist and magic, of dreaming spires. And I want to get beneath some of that. But here's the challenge for me, because at the same time, I want to argue for a relationship between a quality of intellectual collegiality and the nature of society that fosters that intellectual collegiality, particularly as I think it is the non-rational foundations of that society that are often the most important. Those aspects which generate solidarity, a sense of belonging or allegiance, of identity. What I'm talking about here often are the traditions and rituals that underlie all forms of society, those palpable, powerful, felt realities that are not easily measured or talked about objectively. So, both Oxford and Cambridge are perceived as places which are thought of as having an unchanging tradition. It's clearly untrue. Both universities and their constituent colleges are engaged in a continual process of reinvention. How could it be otherwise in a cutting-edge global research university? And this is true even in the area of what you might call ritual and custom. Traditions are invented and reinvented. Indeed, there's a clear insider understanding in Cambridge that a tradition exists when something has happened twice, sometimes just once. And certainly, if it's happened 3 times, we all know it has always been done like that. I plan to illustrate this lecture with reference to the college that I know most intimately, St John's College in Cambridge, using that as a case study. Where's my arrow? There we go. So this is a picture, a quick view from the back of college. This is what we call the new court, which is an entirely ridiculous, over-the-top, romantic Gothic building, which was completed in the early 1830s and nearly bankrupted the college. And just to give you another picture, this is the Bridge of Sighs, an iconic image of Cambridge, which people may well know, links the kind of old and the newer part of the college, coming from 1800 onwards. The colleges in Cambridge look quite similar in many ways, but they're also all very unique institutions, and there are quite significant differences between them. So I am talking about one particular college. This doesn't apply to all, and I'll just give you a quick flavour of it, not as a marketing or PR exercise, but just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. So here are kind of a quick number of points to make about St John's. It's one of the older colleges, just over 500 years old. It was founded as a royal foundation by Margaret Beaufort, the mother of King Henry VII, probably better known as the grandmother of King Henry VIII, notorious tyrant. It's the second largest college in Oxbridge, and what you might describe as one of the least impoverished. Took a moment. We have both undergraduates and graduates. If you look at the aims there, you'll see that religion is part of the core aims, and a lot of people coming out to Cambridge are astonished that religion is so palpable and central to these things. In terms of its foundation as a charity, it's made up of a master, the head of house, fellows, the senior members, and some students, the scholars, those who have achieved most academically. Its academic reputation is particularly strong in natural sciences. It has a very strong reputation in terms of sports, particularly rugby, and therefore has a slightly boisterous feel as a college, perhaps, now and then. It has an internationally renowned chapel choir, and a very distinct kind of ethos. Once a Jonian, always a Jonian is a kind of phrase that comes out, and other Cambridge colleges would sing things like, "We'd rather be at Oxford than at John's." So that gives you a little bit of a sense, it's got a strong sense of identity. Let me now then come on and talk a little bit about the collegiate university, because I think this is quite a difficult thing to grasp outside of Cambridge. So some key essential background, a sketch of the key aspects of the natures of Oxford and Cambridge. Clearly, we are looking at some of the oldest universities in Europe. So, for example, Cambridge has 31 colleges. The earliest college, Peterhouse, dates from 1284. Half the colleges in Cambridge come from before 1600. So the roots of these institutions are firmly in the world of medieval Christendom. Well before the rise of most nation states and nationalism, and from the outset, both universities are deeply local but broadly European. They emerged from monastic foundations and quickly developed strong relationships with ecclesial and political authorities, giving the groups of scholars involved the right to a high degree of self-determination. Secondly, we're looking at partly public-funded and regulated universities. So the UK government has a massive and important stake within the life of the universities. And we're looking at universities which are firmly within the Anglo-American university system, in that they are unabashedly hierarchical and competitive. Governance by scholars, a key aspect of these ancient universities down to the present, has been the ideal, might stress that, the ideal of self-governance, that the universities are run by a general assembly of the dons or fellows. The conviction that academics should play a central and direct part in their own governance, uncontaminated by others, has been seen, rightly or wrongly, as an essential aspect in the protection of intellectual freedom, of a piece with the equality of day-to-day working relationships that constitutes intellectual collegiality. The same is basically true of Oxbridge colleges. In most colleges, all significant decisions are made by the entire fellowship of the governing body, with college officers, the keys being the bursars and senior tutors, implementing those decisions. That model is, of course, impractical in the larger colleges, and there's a modified version of it. So as a consequence, heads of colleges have very little actual power. They are closer then to chairs than CEOs. So what about the colleges then? Oops, sorry, I'm jumping. What about the colleges? The first thing is autonomy. Colleges are perpetual institutions. They are separate legal entities. They have their own foundations and statutes. So they own property, they have endowments, and crucially that autonomy reaches into the core activities, into teaching and research. So Oxbridge colleges, for better or worse, are not upmarket residential halls. They're a different sort of creature altogether. Both Cambridge and Oxford are genuinely collegiate universities. That is their most distinctive feature. And there's a complex web of relationships between the central aspects of the university and the colleges. Slightly romantically, you could call it a sort of ongoing dance between the two. It can be a pretty fraught one at times. And there have been significant kind of fluctuations of power over the century between the centre, as it were, and the colleges. And broadly speaking, colleges have more power and autonomy in Oxford than in Cambridge. So, for example, in terms of autonomy, colleges interview and admit undergraduate students. That is part of what they do. Those students are then admitted subsequently as members of the university. On the other hand, just when you think you've grasped a startling principle, it turns out that the university accepts postgraduate students who then have also to be accepted by colleges. It's a similar story when one considers senior members. Even the most distinguished of academics appointed by the university, if they want to be part of a college, have to be elected to a college fellowship. And that is very far from being automatic, I can assure you. So, from this you can see that colleges in some ways can be seen as small universities. The supervision or tutorial system. In addition to lectures, seminars, lab work, or language classes, at the heart of the Oxbridge system is small group teaching of undergraduates, the tutorial or supervision. Fellows meet students in small groups, usually 2 or 3 in the arts and humanities, in hour-long slots to discuss particular topics, usually following the submission of an essay. It is this intense, face-to-face, resource-rich, as we heard earlier, focus on the student's learning experience that lies at the heart of the teaching activity. And then finally, research. I'll just touch on this point, but I actually think quite a lot can be said. Colleges make a significant and distinctive investment to support individuals with their research through research fellowships and supportive grants, but perhaps most importantly, through the daily business of living within a human scale, interdisciplinary community of scholars. Okay, so those are some of the kind of key elements that go to make up the collegiate university and the relationship between the centre and the colleges. Now let me talk a little bit about the kind of historic background. I'm just going to pick out some key moments within 800 years. Okay, so the first thing is, what we're talking about here is a total institution, or close to it. The origins of the Oxbridge model lie firmly within the medieval church and within a monastic model. Historically, colleges have therefore been close to what might be described as a total institution. The sort of thing I'm talking about here are, you may see the resemblance, prisons, the army, monasteries, or boarding schools. Those are all kind of total institutions. That is, an all-encompassing world coming close to supplying all the needs an individual might have: food, a bed, shelter, community, work, cultural life, religious activity, sport, recreation. In effect, a kind of alternative family. And family is still a word that is often used to describe college life. Like other forms of total institution, ritual and oath or vow taking at entry remains important. So upon admission today, at least in the older, more traditional colleges, fellows, doesn't matter what sort of distinguished professor they might be, still kneel before the master and promise to uphold the college as a place of education, religion, learning and research. This historic pattern and ideal of a total institution is very important and remains influential in the life of colleges even today. The second point I want to make is about the 19th century and what one might call a Victorian Reformation. For most of its life, the colleges of Cambridge University were places where scholar priests trained clergy for the Church of England. And of course, they also trained courtiers, politicians, civil servants, and took in a fair number of sons of the landed gentry. Should, of course, be added, there was also a certain amount of scholarship that also took place. As the ideal of the modern universities spread in the 19th century from Germany, two major changes completely transformed Oxbridge education. So the 19th century completely changed what went on. First, the two universities were entirely reshaped by pretty robust state intervention in the form of two major royal commissions in the 1850s and the 1870s and 1880s. This led to major reform: the introduction of examinations, the setting up of new courses, and in 1860, the removal of the bar on fellows in Cambridge colleges being celibate and having to be ordained in the Church of England. As a consequence, fellows became professional educators and scholars. Religious tests were also removed, and the university and colleges opened to men of all faiths and none. Second, they were influenced by a spirit of reform that had taken hold of the large public, that is, the secondary school systems, the dominant feeder institutions for the two universities. This reform, rooted in what is often called muscular Christianity, took a high view of participation in team sports, linking the development of Christian morality to physical fitness and manly character, and placed a great deal of emphasis on character-forming aspects of education as a whole. And that ideal continues in subtle and interesting ways to shape the ethos of college and university life, as indeed has the sense of intercollegiate competition which that whole kind of initiative has nurtured. As a result of this, the boat race, which is probably one of the most famous things about Oxford and Cambridge, as a result of this Victorian development, in the words of one commentator, playing fields came to be regarded as essential to a university education, a historically curious association that looks quaintly Anglo-Saxon when viewed from Berlin or Paris. And of course, such athletic activity still seems to be a very integral part of the university tradition within the Anglo-American world. Thirdly, science. It is difficult to underestimate the importance of the rise of science within the university world, fairly obviously, and it's also helped to reshape the relationship between the university and the colleges. In Cambridge, natural sciences were developed fairly early on, with a course from 1851, and St John's College, very much a pioneer in this area, even had its own chemistry lab, which was started in 1853. It finally closed in 1914, by which time it became abundantly clear that the facilities required for science needed to be provided centrally within the university. As a result of growing importance of the sciences, and partly as a consequence, the higher levels of government money going direct to the centre meant that the universities shifted progressively in a slightly different direction, one with more obvious direct connections to the wider economy and to industry. But even here, in relation to industry, colleges have been to the fore, creating science and innovation parks. So, for example, my own college, St John's, created an innovation centre which opened in 1987, the first in Europe to focus on supporting knowledge-based businesses and the oldest such business incubator in the United Kingdom. And my last point here is on the changing nature of students from 1900 to 2000. The nature of the student body has evolved a lot in the 20th century. That touches then, obviously, on the question of elitism I raised earlier, but it also raises questions around identity, allegiance, and community life. Clearly, the more homogenous a group of people are, the fewer barriers there are likely to be to the creation of a coherent identity and sense of belonging. So let me give you a quick sketch of the changes involved. Firstly, of course, graduates. In common with the rest of the sector, graduate students now make up a larger proportion of the student body. So whereas undergraduate numbers in St John's have not in fact increased since World War II, the number of graduates doubled from 50 in the late 1930s to 100 in 1960, and there are now 350. The second, and very obviously important change, he says with embarrassment across his face, is that the university only admitted men, and indeed the majority of colleges only began to admit women from the 1970s onwards. Not much more I can say there. The third thing which is just worth touching on here is to look at professional destinations. And I think this is quite striking, that even in 1900, you can see that a large proportion of the cohort entered the Church of England. It shows you how clerically dominated this university was. That clearly changes by the 1920s, and during the 20th century, you get a significant diversification within occupational destinations and an increase in the commercial activity and university work. Two further developments in college admissions are worth noting, which are really from the 1960s onwards, and which move Oxbridge firmly down a trajectory towards more open elite recruitment and away from traditional bastions of privilege. The first is the removal of the hereditary factor. Children of Jonians, in my case, children of college members, no longer receive any preferential treatment. And secondly, preferential consideration is no longer given to sporting ability. That has been put firmly aside. Infringement of either of these principles in undergraduate recruitment today would be regarded as scandalous, and people in the UK would immediately talk about the Daily Mail test. I can explain that later if required. So further detailed analysis show clear shifts in parental occupation and social class composition in St John's, which are much more widely observed within the two universities. So, for example, there's been an almost complete disappearance of the aristocracy and a very significant drop of those coming from private educational backgrounds. A recent study of elite formation at Oxbridge therefore concludes quite confidently by saying that Oxford and Cambridge are clearly no longer the finishing schools of an existing social elite. And this echoes the experience of long-term residents of Cambridge colleges. Finally, and looking forward, one of the most obvious features of this expanding horizon is the internationalisation of college communities, most obviously at the postgraduate level, but also amongst the fellowship of colleges. In St John's College, for example, we have a fellowship of 150, which includes retired fellows as well. And of those 150, there are 30 different nationalities represented, which I think is quite extraordinary. Let me now come on to talk a little bit about inventing traditions to renew the common life. Colleges are forms of social organisations composed of members of a single society with a common loyalty. And I now want to draw you a little deeper into an exploration of how that common loyalty has been sustained and renewed in response to changing need. most especially a more diverse intake, as Oxbridge colleges have become less insular and homogenous and more outward-looking. I'm not saying they haven't got further to go, they obviously do. However, in the movement away from a culture dominated by all-male public school and muscular Christianity, emergent practices and forms of sociality continue to be inspired by traditional core values, which in certain ways often echo the deep past. So in this section, what I'll do is focus on a kind of broadly descriptive approach, illustrated with quite a lot of reference to St. John's, and in the next section will be more kind of general and interpretive. So let me start with the residential community. So this is again this ridiculous romantic Gothic building I mentioned earlier. So Oxbridge colleges are residential. That is, characteristically, undergraduates spend 2 or even 3 of their years as students living in colleges, in courts, on staircases. They are not alone. Amongst them are senior members of the college, from young lecturers to distinguished professors. They are their neighbours, those that they bump into first thing in the morning, late at night, in the college bar, in the cafeteria queue. As individuals, they may or may not talk or interact with each other, but the residential community certainly facilitates such informal interactions. During the 20th century, Oxbridge colleges have worked hard to increase their capacity to house all their students. In the 1930s, it was the goal in St. John's that undergraduates spent 2 out of 3 of their years in college, with the rest of the time in rented accommodation. Now all are accommodated in college, and there have been increased efforts to accommodate all postgraduates, and as we move forward, all postdocs will then be kind of wrapped into that, ideally. Eating. Eating together is very important. Members of college eat together in 2 main locations, one in the cafeteria, but then we also have a formal hall every night with gowns and a 3-course meal. St. John's College encourages such traditional and highly sociable dining and actively keeps the costs down to encourage such gatherings. In addition to everyday, I was going to say informal, I know it doesn't look very informal, to everyday informal interactions like this, we have set-piece formal dinners. So St. John's, there is a dinner for undergraduates in their first years, a halfway hall for second years, and a third-year dinner and then there are parallel experiences for postgraduates. But many of these traditions are in fact quite recent. So, for example, we have a foundation dinner at which all members of the foundation are present, the master, the fellows, the scholars. It sounds like it should have existed from the beginning of the college. In reality, it was only introduced in 1936. This was also the first dinner that the students and fellows were actually distributed across the table, as in they were next to each other and could talk to each other, rather than sitting separately. Let me give you another example. This is the combination room, Elizabethan long gallery. It dates from 1599. Today, on most days, there is a wonderful table, as you can see there, which runs down its length. Every lunchtime, fellows and senior academics dine at that table. But there is a clear principle. You sit at the next seat available and engage with those around you. So, despite the clear echoes of monastic principles of equality and fraternity that embeds, this practice only dates from the 1930s. Fellows had not come together at lunchtime in this way for centuries before that, although it was the common practice at the origins of the college. In addition to these forms of sociality, the colleges have academic societies for different subjects, with visiting and homegrown speakers, usually at evening gatherings, almost always accompanied by a glass of something. Occasionally there's food, occasionally. Furthermore, subject specialists may gather their students for a late evening, what we call a dessert, a post-dinner social occasion with cheese and fruit and what have you. But above all, as always, for conversation. That's what it's all about. And students, much to frequently our surprise, welcome these activities, not least because of the opportunity to engage with and get to know senior members. Colleges have sports teams and musical activities and clubs pursuing all sorts of activities. All of these have senior members involved formally as their senior treasurers. That is, of course, to check that all the finances are done properly, but that provides a hook for deeper involvement by senior members. So senior and junior members can come together to share an interest in hockey, or chess, or netball, or astronomy, or to support the Women's Society, or the LGBT group, or the Christian Union, or Amnesty International. Even Christianity within Oxbridge has almost completely reinvented itself within the 20th century. Colleges have become hothouses for the Anglican choral tradition, such that, for example, Cambridge now has the greatest concentration of elite choirs performing sacred music in the world. It's become a training ground for an extraordinary number and range of classical musicians. Television and radio broadcasts, especially from King's College, are an important part of the university's global brand. In terms of what might be called college religion, that is, those rituals and symbolic moments that are an integral and important part of the college year, again, tradition is completely reinvented, continually reinvented. Rites of passage are consciously marked. So in St John's, we have a very well-attended matriculation and graduation services set within acts of a kind of diffuse form of Christian worship. But this practice only dates to the 1990s. Such a college counterpoint to the university's entry and exit points is deeply valued and reaffirms the identity of the college. So a kind of diffuse, rather English, if I may put it like that, religious activity extends to a wide range of other activities. I, for example, have been involved in the blessing of rowing boats and of punts. I can give you all sorts of detail about them. They're very, very different experiences. Similarly, St John's College has had scholars since 1511, but it was only 5 years ago that it created a public ceremony for students to become scholars, with a secular ritual in the chapel and a tea to which families are invited. Finally, what one might call the college spirit. In short, then, there is a common life shared by senior and junior members that extends beyond the subjects studied. So inevitably, as with all forms of community, particular individuals, eccentric or extrovert or wonderful, students, fellows, staff, will be known by a large proportion of the college community. So certain members of staff will be widely known and will know the students. The friendly porter is a key part of the social ecology. Those who model such friendliness are praised for exemplifying the college spirit, the Jonian way. And indeed, those who do not are quietly acknowledged as not participating in it. They may be judged in whispers to be takers, not givers. There is then absolutely no doubt that in the creation of identity and a sense of solidarity, the college built on a human scale seeks to embed a set of values, a morality, and invisible attitude to life. Let me then come on to the question of the enhancement of learning. How does a small, multidisciplinary, collegiate context in which senior academics and students are thrown together enhance the learning experience? The answer I suggest lies in an interesting mix of competition and cooperation within a community rooted in sentiment and a feeling of shared identity. There are very few empirical studies of the relationship between the Oxbridge College experience and learning, but one paper by Keith Trigwell, 2005, based on 2 separate studies, one quantitative, one qualitative, considers the experience in Oxford colleges and produces a number of findings which resonate strongly with my own observations and experiences. So drawing in part on his study, I'd like to suggest 4 related factors. The first is a sense of allegiance. Trigwell strongly suggests that learning is enhanced by a motivating sense of allegiance. That is, students who take pride in their college, its history, and its current achievements have a sense of being part of something larger, something that matters, even that they shouldn't let the college down. That motivation is wrapped up in a feeling of being part of a tradition in which the example of others can be evoked to motivate individuals to certain attitudes or practices. It may be a founding figure, in our case in St John's, a clever and politically astute woman, Lady Margaret, or Bishop John Fisher, whose conscience led him to conflict with that notorious tyrant King Henry VIII and a date with an execution block, or the campaigner for the abolition of the slave trade, William Wilberforce. The example of historic alumni can be important in inspiring people, but as always, it's important to show how people overcome particular challenges or difficulties. Thanks. An example in St John's is Fred Sanger, who won 2 Nobel Prizes in chemistry but struggled badly with mathematics and was helped by a tutor to find his way to biochemistry. He also took longer over his undergraduate degree than usual, and his first PhD topic didn't work out. His achievements then are an inspiring testimony, frankly, to guts and determination and sheer hard work. The sense of allegiance to a college is also further embedded by competition between colleges, and that works most naturally and most successfully when it's not about academic things, when it's about sport or music or something like that. Allegiance is important as it helps to cement the idea that one belongs. And we all clearly need a sense of belonging to help us develop and flourish. We have a desire to form and maintain enduring interpersonal attachments, and the human scale of colleges allows for the development of friendships and leads to a reduction in isolation or loneliness. This in turn obviously assists learning, and good quality relationships help motivate people to learn, increase confidence, social competence, and improved all-round well-being. The third focuses on peer-to-peer learning. It's not really very surprising that an Oxford system is good at encouraging high levels of what might be described as engager behaviour in groups of students within a discipline, but not only is there good interaction between people in the same subject in the same year, there's very good interaction between people in the same subject across years, and that's enhanced by informal mentoring processes. So one mechanism we have in Oxbridge, which is very much an informal thing set up by the students, is called parenting, where students have the opportunity to engage with current students who act as college parents, assisting them to settle in when they arrive, and that also provides a kind of induction into the culture of learning within the community, sometimes passing on specific insights about aspects of study, usually helpful, sometimes not. What Trigwell also found, however, was that students engaged academically with students in other disciplines, and I think this is a really key aspect. So nearly half of the Oxford students in his study claimed that they often engaged academically with students in other disciplines, and they experienced this as significantly beneficial. That's quite clear to me in my own context. It's perhaps most obvious in the Cambridge system. You can actually change courses relatively easily, change your degree course. And the fact that people have talked to each other and understand what another subject is about means that sometimes you get people tracking from quite different courses very successfully within that Cambridge system. Finally, the teacher-student relationship. This is obviously very important to learning, and a positive relationship between teachers and tutors plays an important part in terms of students' learning. It facilitates effort, commitment, motivation, satisfaction, engagement, achievement, and intellectual development. Two factors here emerge as being of particular importance. They are first, the quality of the relationship between student and teacher, which I suggest has two dimensions. The affective dimension, that is the bond between students and teachers, which forms the basis for secure and positively experienced relationships, so those marked by honesty, truth, and respect. strangely. Oh, 1 minute, hey? Ooh, okay, might be a little stretched, 1 minute. So obviously teachers who care for their students, teach respectively and try to promote student integration are unsurprisingly more effective. The second thing is the supportive dimension, that in the setting of clear expectations, marking of work, answering emails, all that sort of thing. So those two dimensions, effective and supportive. The second point, and this is a key claim, I think, one of the most important claims one might make in the residential context, is that the quality of that relationship between teacher and student is primarily determined by out-of-classroom interactions. When the focus is exclusively on task focuses, when everything is focused on the task orientation, students don't tend to approach teachers, even when those teachers have an explicit pastoral role. There are a number of pretty obvious and straightforward human reasons for this. They're uncertain whether lecturers are really interested in a relationship with them. They have the impression, doubtless correct, that lecturers are under a lot of time pressure and don't want to disturb them. They're uncertain about the benefits of a relationship of that sort, and they may indeed fear a negative encounter. So approachability is very, very important. Those out-of-classroom interactions. Oxbridge colleges provide all sorts of extraordinary, sometimes slightly bizarre opportunities for out-of-classroom experiences. A shared participation in sports and music is one of them. I'll just give a very quick illustration because this just shows how weird Cambridge is. They have rowing, but the river in Cambridge wiggles like that. You can't row side by side, so you have to row behind and you bump the boat in front. This goes over a 4-day period, so the student boats try and bump each other. Very occasionally, some particularly mad fellows might decide to have a fellows boat, so you have the fellows rowing against the students. That sort of activity generates a certain frisson and certain engagement. I'm winding up. Just to show you, this is the humorous bit, you see. The students, of course, put their weight. As you can see, their fellows put their ages. So that gives you a sense of just how wholesale the interaction can be. Of course, students are utterly, utterly humiliated when they discover that they've been bumped and beaten by a group of octogenarian, or not quite octogenarian, fellows. Okay, so very, very quickly, I'm just going to say 3 points in the last minus 30 seconds that I have. Nurturing the inquiring mind. This is this quote I had pinched from Stefan Collini's book on What University's For. Very good, short book, excellent, well worth reading. We need to hold on to the vision. What we're about here is the ungovernable play of the inquiring mind. There's a huge amount of pressure on universities, which is about audit cultures, it's about the numbers, etc., etc. We need to hold on to the vision. Second, we need to champion collegiality, and I think Oxbridge has a very strong and important role in championing that, and part of doing that is to promote networks and hospitality. We have a lot of overseas visiting scholars in Oxbridge, and I think that's very important. And we should be promoting networks as we are today and tomorrow. And then, like I said, there's a continual process of creative reinvention. I think the biggest challenge that Oxbridge has from a collegial point of view in the next 20 or 30 years is increasing internationalisation. How do you get a very international group of people at undergraduate level to integrate one with another, rather than falling into cliques based on ethnic or religious or other forms of identity? So continually and very self-consciously creating community is really an essential part of what we do, so that people can genuinely feel that then they walk around an institution which is 500 or 800 years old, they are walking in the steps of others. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Dormant. We will now open the floor to questions, so if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand and we'll bring a mic to you.
Right, thank you very much, Reverend Duncan. I actually have some mythological questions. It could be naive, but then it's quite mythological. I realized that some of the cornerstones of St. John's education, religion, learning and research. I'm just wondering how we're able to combine religion without being biased. So my question is, do you promote religious diversity such that if undergrads or postgraduate students are applying for residence in the college, they will not have the perception that because they belong to other religious bodies, they will be disadvantaged? And how fair would you actually put religion in your selection procedure? And the last one is, we're talking about collegiality. How do you combine or champion global collegiality with religion, since already it's well-defined religious bloc? Thank you.
Great questions. Thank you. It's difficult to convey quickly what I've sort of described as a diffuse English kind of Christianity. It's quite clear to me that only certain sorts of, how to put this? It's a university. It's about free inquiry. That is absolutely non-negotiable. So the sorts of, the main form of religiosity within Cambridge, which is institutional, is what's called choral evensong. My approach to that, as the dean of the chapel, is, if I can put it bluntly and apologise to anyone who's offended, I don't care what your belief is. It's irrelevant to me. I don't care what's in your head when you come into this service. If you enjoy this experience, and it's quite a passive, meditative kind of thing, there's a lot of beautiful music, people can come in of whatever faith or none, absolutely zero problem as far as I'm concerned. So there's not a kind of heavy push in terms of the institutional religion at all. Part of the role, and it's kind of liberal Anglicanism which probably facilitates this, I have an absolute responsibility to everybody who comes in to help and support them, whatever their religious background or none. For me to show any sort of partisanship, or for the college to show any sort of partisanship, is absolutely not acceptable, if I can put it like that. So that's kind of clear and categorical. Occasionally there are religious practices or beliefs, people who are perhaps a bit intolerant or what have you, and they need to be challenged and worked with. So people are very dogmatic or are interfering with other people's behaviours, that has to be challenged. So there's that side of it as well. So in a sense, and it helps for someone to be religiously literate, if I can put it like that, for that challenge to be, so if I've got very sectarian or very conservative forms of Christian who are saying this is acceptable, that I'm the one who would have to go and say, look, that's not on. That's not acceptable. So in practice, there may be a perception issue, as you've expressed. In reality, I don't think, though some might say you're not in the right place to answer that question, I don't think there is any form of prejudice, if I can put it like that. Does that sort of... I appreciate it's quite difficult for people to grasp, because it's a very kind of diffuse English form of quite liberal, inclusive kind of Christianity, which is different from many people's experience. And there's certainly lots of people, I sometimes appoint chaplains, and you kind of look at some people and you think, no way, you can't appoint a sick person. I'll give you a clear example. It would be inconceivable in my mind to appoint somebody who had problems with gay people or people in gay relationships. That to me just couldn't be possible. If that's an example.
So you sometimes, or is it the notion of perception that religious people impose on students, but once you're in there and the tradition is there, you impose to practice religion in terms of being tradition. You still have that kind of experience.
I don't think so. But like I say, I'm the wrong person to ask you. You kind of need to find a student who'd say, oh yes, the dean's important. No, I don't think so. It's very much a voluntaristic kind of world. The chapel is quite large and it sits in the middle of the college, and people it's more kind of quirky. You can look and think, what's that doing here? I take the view that as dean of chapel, I'm totally irrelevant to all students until they say otherwise, if I can put it like that. And I quite like that, actually. I'd say from a religious point of view. I think that's how it is. But, if they want to come along to stuff, that's great. If they don't, that's not a problem at all. Some of my most regular chapel goers are people who say, I'm not religious. because they come for the music and the space, and that's fine. I hope that helps.
We'll also have another panel discussion at 2 p.m. on a similar question. So I'm afraid that will have to be the last question for now. So thank you very much, Reverend Dormer, for your time.